You're all very welcome to the June Trasna na Tíre lecture series. Thanks a million for tuning in. Just a quick update before we start tonight's lecture. So tomorrow we have Sean O'Keeffe from Kerry, Sean O'Leary, and he will have a big, he already has a big following, so I think that's going to be fascinating. On Wednesday we have zooming in from Oklahoma, we have Dr. Ian Thompson, who's going to tell us about the Choctaw Nation. And as we all know, it's really topical in the last few weeks. The Choctaw Nation donated to the Irish people during the Irish famine. It was great to have him. And on Thursday, I'm particularly looking forward to this lecture from Dominic Price. So it's going to be about the World War I veterans experience in Ireland. So great to have Dominic back again for his second lecture. So our speaker tonight is a great historian, Maurice O'Keeffe. He used to work in the antiques business. He lives close to my home place in Tralee, County Kerry. He has produced a phenomenal amount of books, audio recordings, and oral history, and it's all available on his website, Irish Life and Lore. He actually now has over 4,000 oral recordings available, and they're all available, and they cover right across Ireland. He's covered topics as diverse as great houses, which we're discussing tonight, and he's also covered oral recordings of the Troubles in Ulster. So quite a diverse oral history record on his website. Maurice's wife Jane produced this book, which is a fantastic account of some of the families in Cork and Kerry, voices from the great houses of Cork and Kerry. So I caught up with Maurice a couple of weeks ago and we recorded this lecture. And if you roll it there, Colette, my able assistant will get the lecture going.
Right. Well, this is a chapter in our Irish history that I think has been ignored to a great degree. I'm going to, for the next while, I'm going to give you examples of what it was like for Anglo-Irish families to live in the Great House. And we're going to visit a lot of the counties in Ireland, and we're going to talk about these great houses. And so we often look in the landscape and think, you know, there's a burnt out house, a big house in the distance. And, you know, we never question what happened, who lived in that house, why is it in ruins, and how did it manage to change hands, and who now owns the land, and so on. So it's really the demise of the Irish nobility, the Irish Anglo-Irish families. If you happen to be Protestant, if you were part of the ascendancy and you lived in one of these great houses, you were a target. And these houses, many of them burnt down, a lot of them gutted, and some of them rebuilt again and now lived in with other people. So we're going to start, and each place I visit, I'm going to introduce the person, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the background, the reasons why the house was burnt down, and then we move on to the next one. So we're going to start in County Waterford and Jimana Estate, and Emily Villiers-Stewart, who is still living and in that house in Jimana, is the first person I'm going to visit. And there we're going to talk about, first of all, her family name and how she was connected to the Fitzgeralds, who had been there for 1,200 years. And then she's going to talk about the loss of this magnificent Georgian house that just fell down around them. And so we start with Emily. Emily Villiers Stewart,
yes.
Here just outside Cappoquin. Tell me about the name and how it came about.
Well, originally they were the Fitzgeralds, who were descended from the Earls of Desmond. And there was a girl only who then married a Villiers. And then after a good many generations, again, there was a daughter only, no son, and she married a Stewart. And that's how it became Villiers Stewart. And this is the tower house of the old Desmond Castle, the base of it. And the top was rendered unsafe in the 1640 rebellion. It was built about approximately 1200. And the same family has been here all the time. And in the 1640 rebellion, they fought over it for 7 years. The rebels got in and the other side got in, and it was completely destroyed at the top. So they pulled the top down, and they decided possibly the warring days weren't quite so bad, and they would build a house going west-east, which is what we've just walked through now to get here. And according to Smith's History of Waterford, until a more commodious house could be built. And the more commodious house was up there, and that was the Georgian house, which was very, very large and impressive. And that was, in fact, pulled down, I can't remember, I think 1964, 65.
And Emily goes on to talk about the reasons why this house was left run down. Was there a time when in the 50s that it became run down and it was difficult?
Oh, it was run down long before that. It had been, the real trouble was that the Land Acts took land off these estates, and that made them uneconomic. And because they didn't have enough to produce things from the land to carry the number of people they employed, the upkeep of everything that had to be kept up, whether it was roads, avenues. I mean, where you came in from the bridge, this is half of the avenue. Well, keeping that road up and then same on again alone was quite an expensive job.
And the Land Commission, was there any?
Well, we eventually sold to the Land Commission. We had they didn't really want to buy it. They paid us £28 an acre. You know what land makes now?
So as soon as they got the land, they had to...
Well, they rented it for a number of years, not too long, and got their money back in rent. And then they divided it into different farms, and those houses you see just at the top here, there's 4 houses, belong to the 4 farmers who now own the land.
And were these people originally working here?
No, they weren't at all. They were brought from up more hill land, as you might say, down to better land. There's the Cullinans, the O'Briens, the Nugents, and the Cattles.
And just finally, before we leave Jimana, Emily talks about how the government had been responsible, really, at the time for really wanted to get rid of the ascendancy. You were working away with James on the farm and trying to rear a family and to try and run the farm. I mean, why didn't you stay with it? Why didn't you stick with it?
We couldn't afford to pay the rates. The rates were thousands of pounds in those days on the property. The government is what ruined all these places. They wanted to get rid of the ascendancy in those days. Now they're sad that they have, but they wanted to get rid of the big places in the 50s. They were only too happy to pull them down. There was a beautiful stable yard just over there for 28 horses and 2 very nice houses, one at each end of the building, and a yard inside. And when the Land Commission divided the land up, they scratched their heads and said, it wouldn't be fair to give these beautiful buildings to one farmer, so we better pull them down. And they did.
So now we move over to the neighbouring county, Wexford, and the Boxwells, or the landed gentry there. I visited Butlerstown, and I spoke to Helen Screen, and Helen first told me about her background.
Well, there's a great sense of history in the place here, and when you consider the Tower House and the castle, and this house was built in what year?
We don't know, and I have been trying to find out who actually built it. It's a very curious house, and the Boxwells were fairly curious people, and I think that they may have built it, but possibly it was started by the Harveys. When they came here, there was no roof on the castle. The castle was without a roof for 100 years, and my grandfather, who was a scholar, one of the only 3 young men who was awarded a scholarship into Trinity College as a freshman before he even went there. He went into the Indian Civil Service and had a good income.
What was your grandfather's name?
John Boxwell. He ended up as commissioner in the capital of Bengal, as it then was, Dhaka.
Yes.
But died of cholera. But he re-roofed the castle, which must have been a very big and expensive job with all the debris that had fallen in and everything. And it is now the best preserved tower house in the 3 southeastern counties, or so I've been told by the Heritage Council. So we try to keep it going. And that was when they said, well, perhaps we had to sell up and go to England. And that was when my father said he'd rather die than go to live in England.
Put his foot down.
His foot down.
And
so we somehow or other survived. My mother was heard to say, the only thing that will save us is if there's another war, because she knew from her sister, who lived half a mile away with her farmer husband, that when the first Great War came, all the prices went up, and he managed to educate his 2 sons in Trinity College from what he got for the price of his cattle. A war is good for farmers in Ireland, because suddenly England wants everything we can produce. And my mother said, what we need is another war. Of course, she didn't want another war. Her brother had been killed in it. But she was actually right, because when the war came, all the prices soared, and we were able to make a living again.
And very interestingly, Helen says here that religiously the community was divided. So she has very strong views on this. And then she reiterates the fact that the family wanted to stay where they had been for many generations.
There was at that time, I think, a tremendous ambivalence about the Protestant feelings. A great many of them left Ireland after 1922 because they saw the way things were going, and they felt the ties with England were very strong indeed. But a lot of them stayed on, and I suppose hoped that perhaps we might become a member of the Commonwealth, like Canada and Australia, and would live much more happily then without domination from England, but as part of the Commonwealth. I think that would have been probably what they hoped for.
Would it have come into your parents' mind at any stage to leave and to go back to England?
Absolutely not. I've heard my father say that he'd rather die than go to live in England, because there was a time here during the Depression after the war.
The Civil War.
After the Civil War, and all the hungry 30s. Very difficult to farm here. My father had left early because he felt that he needed to be here, and so he didn't get his full pension. And we had the annuities from the farm. What do I mean annuities? There was an income from the farm, which was at that time quite big. A lot of it had been bought by my great-grandfather. So there was quite an income. But then it suddenly stopped, you see, after the Land Act, the last Land Act went through. And so we were strapped for money. There was a time when we wondered whether we would survive here. And the bank called my father in and said, "What's going on? You're overdrawn, you're always overdrawn." My father was hopeless with money and never interested in it. He'd been educated at Shrewsbury, and money was not a thing that you talked about. But my mother ran everything, and she was fed up because the bank manager should have asked her to go in, not my father. And my father said, "Well, we'd have to close down the farm." That's what the bank manager said. And my mother said, "You can't do that. You leave Mattie Devericks without a job. And Bill Sutton and other people that we employ, we have to keep going." So she was the one that carried on, and then 4 of us children, 5 of us, to educate. Well, 2 of them were already educated by then, but they were very tough times.
And we move now down to Kerry, to my own county, and the Tutes of Tute Hall, out in the outskirts of Tralee, a place called Ballygarn, were there for 300 years, over 300 years. And they were driven from their place around the beginning of the 1900s. But interestingly, Francis Tute, who I spoke to, who would be the family historian and connected to the family, Desmond Tute, who was the last Tute to live in Tute Hall. He first here describes what the house looked like, and then how long the family had been there.
Daniel Tute is recorded as having built his first house at Tullygarran on the McElligott property in the year 1630. Now, the design of the house, as you see from the last photographs that I have of it, which was taken around 1900, it was a Georgian house with 2 large bays in front, very plain, fronted in stone. And Desmond told me that he can't remember whether they had running water in it throughout the house, but they certainly never had any electricity, even up to the time that he left, which was in the 1920s. So it was basically a large Georgian house, and it must have had gardens around it, but I fear that was not something that I asked him about.
Did he talk about why they left abruptly then?
Well, the Tutes had, so far as I can understand, that the Tutes had quite a good reputation locally. When in the eternal confrontation between Catholic and Protestant, that in the penal days, the Tutes had a reputation of being very liberal, refusing to have much truck with the second citizen treatment of Catholics, and that when priests were threatened with death, that the Tutes would hide them in Tute Hall until the latest pogrom was over. So that the background, I feel, was probably originally that they had settled in happily into their life as Anglo-Irish, and that when the Troubles started to build up in the 1880s, and again, I think I'm going on what Desmond told me, around the 1880s, Troubles seriously started, and Francis Blennerhassett Tute found tenants refusing to pay rents, dead animals being thrown in at the door, windows being smashed. And evidently at one stage things got so bad that he personally, in his late 60s, left for England and then settled, as I say, in Southsea. But his son stayed on and attempted to keep a life going for the family. But during the events of the early 20th century, they were apparently threatened so much by the IRA in their neighborhood, if that was the name of the arm of the Republican movement at that stage, I'm not too sure, but that the younger son, or rather the younger son who had just died in the First War, his widow and her second husband and their children left for Dublin, and even in Dublin they were apparently not safe because they were warned by the police that there was a price on their heads and that they wouldn't survive if they stayed there more than 2 or 3 more days. And so they very quickly, the whole family then left for England and never came back.
Oh, it's extraordinary. And was he in any way emotional about this? Was he? Did he revisit Chute Hall at any stage?
Well, I don't think he did revisit Chute Hall. He became a soldier, professional soldier in the British Army, and so far as I understand, he didn't return. He was certainly emotional about it, in that was the whole of his background had been lost. I mean, he felt emotionally attached to Ireland, as who wouldn't after such a long family history in Kerry.
And now we move up to North Cork and Balhooly. And this is an interesting story, and it has connections with Kerry as well, because Conventmore was the seat of Listowells, and Listowells, of course, had lots of land in North Kerry, and the town Listowel is called after them. So it is a fascinating story. Actually, during the Troubles, the house was gutted by the IRA. But the land had been put up for sale, and the Ross family, who were living down in Dunmanway, moved to Balhooly in Conventmore and took over the land. So Frank Ross's father and uncle ran the property. And interestingly, Frank Ross is the father of Mike Ross, the rugby international. So it makes it very personal, and it's quite an interesting story.
I'm here with Frank Ross of Conventmore, which was originally owned by Lord Listowel here in Ballyhooly, and I'm very interested to kind of know the background to that, Frank. But how long are the Rosses there?
Our family bought their farm, 400 acres, in 1920, December 1920, for the princely sum of 12,750. My father was the eldest of a boy. He was the second eldest, and we then had to contend with local people because the Listowells' house was burnt in 1922. They then tried to put pressure on us to vacate the land, and my father had numerous escapes in the early 20s, and then they tended to leave us alone at that stage.
But I'm fascinated by the whole story, and the very fact that your father had to, fight his corner when he went in there first.
Yeah.
No, sorry, your uncle Tom.
Yeah.
He had to fight his corner.
Yes,
because
my uncle Tom was mobbed here in Ballyhooly, right, and he was tied to the chapel gates, and the priest released him, and they nicknamed him the Protestant priest.
And does that upset you?
No, because we have to move on from there, right? Because you look at it, I have no particular loyalty to England, right? Our family considers itself very Irish, right?
Yeah. But
in a different way.
Yeah.
Our outlook is slightly different. I think we have a more worldly outlook, right? And we have to deal with, but what I have a problem with is if someone manages to put a label on you and doesn't get to know you. But if you get to know a person, it's very difficult to label them.
And before we leave Conventmore, I wanted to find out more about the Stoles. So I went to London to speak to Francis Hare, who is now the present Lord Listowel.
I'm here in London in the Reform Club, and I'm with Lord Listowel. Conventmore was actually burnt down during the Troubles.
Yeah.
Was there any, regret or disappointment, or did anybody say anything in your family?
There are just two things I recall about the burning down of Conventmore. One is that the British government refunded my grandfather for the financial loss of the burning down of the home, which sort of as well as surprised me because, I don't know how these things worked back then, but that's one side of it. And then the other one is a story about a gardener who used to work at Conventmore and who met my father at one point, and he said, "I'm terribly sorry, we didn't mean to, we went to the wrong house." Now, I can't tell you any more about that story, but that's that's something that was passed down. Yes.
Fine. So, okay, now we move over to Knocklofty, and Knocklofty is in South Tipperary, and is now a very fine hotel. But it was the seat of Donoughmores, the Earl of Donoughmore. And so this is a story that is quite touching, and it's quite long, so I hope you can bear with it. So the current Lord Donoughmore, his name is Michael Healy Hutchinson. And I visited him to find out that his parents had been kidnapped by the IRA during the Troubles. So he very passionately talks about this and that story, and then how he feels himself today about his Irishness and the results of that kidnapping.
Here in the home of Nicholas.
No, so I just go there, and
I'm here in a lovely village, Banton, in Oxfordshire, and I'm talking to Lord Donoughmore. It's, if I could call you Mick or Mike.
That's much easier.
It's a lovely place to be, and nice to be in your house this morning and talking to you. Can I talk to you first about your background and the title?
I've got several titles. Donoughmore is an Irish title. I've got English ones as well.
The family background, can you talk to me a little bit about your family history then?
Well, I suppose you could say the family started its more modern history with the provost, who was provost of Trinity College. And
what was his name?
I think he was called John. And he got the first title And he was a TD, and obviously quite eminent in Irish politics at the time. We were talking about 1700 or something like that. And he was the sort of start of the family, really.
Okay.
And the modern version of it, anyway.
And the family seat?
Is in Tipperary, near Clonmel. And my family got the land, I've always understood, at the time of when I think it was Henry VIII, was abolishing the Catholic establishments and stealing the money from the Catholics, if you like. And among other things, he gave something like 10,000 acres of land in Tipperary to my ancestors and bought their farm in Norfolk. And in exchange for the 10,000 acres, he had to be prepared to produce 50 soldiers when required, which wasn't very often, but it did happen, I believe.
Interesting, yeah. Your young life, have you any memories of Knocklofty at all?
Well, I went there often, but I never lived there because my father inherited it in 1947 when his father died, and he moved to live there for the rest of his life.
During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, your parents were kidnapped by the
They were, yes.
Do you remember? You remember very well, I'm sure, that time.
It's written hard into my memory.
Where were you living at that time?
I was in Paris at the time when we heard about it. And of course we flew straight to Ireland to see if there's anything we could do to help, which wasn't much. But it didn't last very long. They were kidnapped for about 4 or 5 days, I think.
Yeah.
And then they were released. We understand by the officers of the Pope. Mark would probably know more about it than I do.
I see, yeah.
But my understanding is that the Pope brought pressure to bear on the head of the church in Ireland, who apparently knew who these people were and told them they'd be excommunicated if they didn't release my parents immediately, because the Pope was a friend of my father, personal friend. And my father used to go and see him several times a year to discuss how they could bring the churches a bit closer to each other. And so when my father was kidnapped, the Pope was rather shocked.
Did he visit the Vatican very often?
A couple of times a year.
And did they make any headway towards
I don't think so. Not aware of it.
But they were good friends.
They were good friends, yes.
And so Michael continues now talking about the results of that kidnapping.
That's a fascinating story. And so those couple of days, the effect, I'm sure that it probably didn't seem as bad until afterwards.
Well, they were held prisoner for about, I think it was 4 or 5 days. But when they captured my parents, which was at the front door of Knocklofty, my father tried to resist, and they hit him on the head with, I think, with a pistol or a gun of some sort. And he must have bled a lot, because when he was released, they checked him, and his blood pressure was less than 50, not pressure, the blood count was less than 50%. You ought to be nearly dead at that point. He was practically bled out to nothing. And it damaged his health for good. His mind was slowly going, and his heart was pretty well wrecked. And 4 or 5 years later, he died.
Oh, and
entirely because of that. In effect, it was murder.
And your mother, how did she cope with all of this?
Well, she was wonderful, She always was. She was a very strong personality, and she looked after him fantastically well. And she did absolutely everything anyone could possibly do. But of course, she couldn't give him a new heart, and he couldn't give him a new brain. It was really sad to see. If you tried to talk to him, which of course I did on more than one occasion, by the time he'd finished his sentence, he'd forgotten what he said at the beginning of it.
Yes.
And it frustrated him beyond all belief, because he realized what the score was.
Yes. Did it leave an after effect on you? Were you, how did you see Irish politics then? Did it change your mind on anything?
I'm not really a politician, but
was that a landmark in your own mind of Irishness and Irish people?
No, but it made me decide that we didn't want to move to live there, because we were getting about one threat a month against my children or myself.
Where?
In Ireland. They threatened our lives regularly.
And where were you living in Ireland at this stage?
I wasn't living in Ireland. I was in Paris.
But
I came to Ireland every now and again.
Oh, I see. And when you were there, you got the letters.
It got to the point where the minister, I've forgotten his name now, asked me to try to visit Ireland without using my name.
I see.
Which I did for several years.
Why were you singled out? Or
I think because the people that actually kidnapped my parents got caught. And they went to jail, not for long actually. I think they got about 3 or 4 years in jail, something like that. You probably can look it up.
Yeah.
But the result was, as far as I was concerned, that I didn't want to go back and live in a country where my children were under threat of death.
Yeah.
So we didn't move to Ireland when my father died.
Would that have made a difference? Would you have gone if you hadn't got those threats?
I might have done, but it didn't really come into my thoughts seriously.
Yeah.
But probably I wouldn't have done anyway, because I don't think I could have afforded to live there. Knockcroft was a big place. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Oh, yes.
And my parents were spending fortunes keeping it going.
Yeah.
And I knew perfectly well I could never have afforded that. I was not exactly impoverished, but I certainly couldn't have afforded that.
But I asked you earlier, your father inherited the title and he was an Irish peer. And when he died, you inherited the title.
That's
and
right.
You're an Irish peer. How do you stand do you see yourself as Irish or English, or how do you stand there?
I feel more English, I think, but the Irish government have offered me, in the distant past, but they might still, I don't know, Irish citizenship if I wanted it.
Would you accept it?
I might have done at the time, but I'm quite happy as I am now. I'm too old to change.
So, that's a very that's an extraordinary segment. But right now we're going to move over to County Kildare and Kilkea Castle, which is just absolutely amazing building. And this was once the property of the Duke of Leinster and Carton House. They owned Carton House, and actually Carton House was the seat of the Leinsters. But it's extraordinary how they lost everything in the last century. And to find out more, I spoke to Maurice Fitzgerald, the Duke of Leinster, the current Duke of Leinster.
I'm here in Oxfordshire and I'm talking to Maurice Fitzgerald, the Duke of Leinster, and it's lovely to be here in your company. It's an amazing story. You see yourself as an Irishman.
Mm.
Your
I'm at home in Ireland.
You're at home in Ireland every time you go there.
Fiona says to me, she said, it's amazing. You get off that ferry and suddenly you start speaking with what I call the educated Dublin accent. I haven't spoken it for years.
Yeah.
But I slip into it.
And when you were you ever seen as a Anglo-Irish or?
I think certainly there was a time, yes, didn't matter. We were seen as Anglo-Irish. Certainly when Father sold Kilkay, he was basically told that he can't sell it to anyone else but the Land Commission. And they bought it and paid next to nothing, then refused to pay us for 2-3 years because they said that we had to prove that we were the actual rightful owners of it.
Of the land, yeah.
And then they turned around a year after it had all been paid for and sold it, the grounds, for exactly the same price that they bought the whole of the lot from us, which never went down well with Father. And that was the question you asked about the Anglo-Irish business, because I think even my brother, when he finished training and was looking for another job, that there was an awful lot of, but you're Anglo-Irish.
Yeah.
And we'd give it to an Irishman, not an Anglo-Irish. He felt definitely that he was at a disadvantage when he was going for job interviews.
And so very quickly now we move over to Kells in County Meath and to the Marquess of Hedford, which is now a very fine prep school and still runs as a school. And this was all started by his aunt, who in 1949, actually, the house became too expensive to keep it going, again, because they had lost so much land, that they opened it as a school. But there's quite an interesting story here, quite funny too. During the Reformation years, the family, the Hedford, saved a priest from being killed by the militia at the time, and a blessing was put on the family.
I'm here with the Marquess of Hedford, Christopher Taylor. Was there ever a threat on the house?
I don't remember a threat on the house as such, although obviously we kept things locked up and had a big strong room, and the guns were always locked up with a lot of family shotguns and things. We used to have air displays there, and when English clubs came over, there was security and stuff, and there'd be one or two people knocking about from time to time, which might have been a bit suspicious. But no, I don't remember there being a threat. And we actually were lucky enough as a family to have, instead of a curse, we had an Irish blessing. I don't know if that was anything to do with it, but
How do you mean?
Well, a lot of old families have curses on them, but we had the opposite, because in a time when Ireland was under English rule, and the militia were coming down to Kells and to Hedford, we were very sympathetic towards the hedging priests. And so the story goes is that the main gates were shut to delay them coming in. And as a result of which, one of them put a blessing on the family that the eldest son would always live to be 21 and to inherit. Unlike, for example, families like the Waterfords, where, in some cases you get the opposite to that. So that's perhaps why I was quite wild in my youth.
It's a good story.
So, yes, well, now, yet again, another amazing, great house. This was also burnt and gutted, but rebuilt again, and is now Kildalton Agricultural College in Pilltown in Kilkenny. And I spoke to the Earl of Bisborough and Miles Ponsonby. So Miles told me about having both his grandparents' houses burnt during the Troubles. His mother's people were the Somervilles from East Cork, and in Castlelymes, a place called Castlemary. But the house here is Bisborough, and the Earl and the seat of the Bisboroughs. And so when I spoke to Lord Bisborough, he told me first about the family background.
Oh, the Bisboroughs, your background. Can you fill me in a bit on your history?
Well, we're a lot of squires from Cumbria, or Cumberland used to be called, near Egremont, so on the west coast of Cumbria. Mm-hmm. And one of my ancestors in about 1650 raised a regiment of horse, is the story, and it's all in the family history here, and went to Ireland to fight with Cromwell, I think. Dare we say that? And then they got given a grant of lands, and then they got a succession of titles, and they worked in various offices of state in Ireland, and also then later in England.
Okay, and during the Confederate Wars, when your ancestors fought with Cromwell, were they high-ranking? Were they?
Well, I think the the first one to do that really was a fairly high-ranking soldier, which is why he was given a grant of lands. So the first one who wasn't the Earl of Besbury, he was John Ponsonby from Cumbria, but he was given a grant of lands, and the family history tells us that another officer was jealous of this, and so he did a swap. And when the Ormonds came back into power, the other chap was thrown out, and my lot kept their bit of land, which is in Kilkenny. And then they built a house called Besborough, probably because one of the wives was called Elizabeth, so it was Bessborough.
Oh, I see.
And that's where the family.
What did the house look like?
It's been rebuilt as an agricultural college, Kildalton. Yeah. It's a pretty severe-looking stone house, quite big.
Yeah.
It was burnt down by the IRA in the Troubles in 1920, 2021.
And just the Earl of Besbury continues, and I asked him the reasons why he thought that the Irish, the Anglo-Irish at the time, were so bitter against Protestant families living in the Great House. But first he talks more about the burning of the two houses.
What were can you talk me through that, the circumstances? What exactly, were they given notice? Were they?
No, it was my great uncle actually.
Who was living there at the time?
Yeah, and he decided to up sticks and move to England. So he bought a house in Sussex.
Yeah.
But the family were not in residence at the time. But the domestic staff would have been. They weren't trying to kill a lot of people. They gave them notice and said, "You better leave the house because we're going to set fire to it."
Why do you think they burnt it?
Well, they burnt an awful lot of Anglo-Irish houses.
Okay. And was there any particular reason why they burnt Besborough?
I don't know. I really don't know. I know that my grandmother's house near Clorin at Castlemary, which her parents were in at the time, we have a letter addressed to my father from the local undertaker in Middleton called Hyde, Mr. Hyde, and he wrote a letter to my father saying that they didn't have any particular animosity towards the family, but they were worried that it was being used as a garrison.
See,
that was in the case of Castle Mary, but I don't know the background to the Besborough fire.
I see. But both properties were burnt.
Both my father's, grandfather's, and so my father's mother and father both had their family houses burnt.
So just when you think of Irish history and the way things happened and the awful spate of burnings that you talk about and the hatred, complete hatred for Anglo-Irish families, where do you think that hatred came from?
That's a very interesting question. It would take several hours to answer, but I think I try and sit on both sides of the fence. I love Ireland, and my wife and I bought a house in Ireland subsequently, to the family house being sold off. So I often think about it. I think Ireland was a difficult neighbour for England, and because she was always Catholic and bringing in the French and the Spanish and anyone else who'd come along and give England a good beating up, or maybe an invasion. So I think England found Ireland quite a difficult neighbour, and I think Ireland found England a pretty unpleasant colonial power. And they were almost bound to fight, weren't they, I think. But luckily they stopped fighting now.
Do you think that sectarianism was part of all of that?
I think it probably was, although a lot of the Irish leaders, I think, were probably Protestant, and there were plenty of Catholics in England who went through various purges at various times. But it wasn't just religious sectarianism, I don't think. I think it was really colonial, and home rule was obviously a topic that was argued about on both sides of the Irish Sea for many, many, many years, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the results of the British Empire when it got smaller, every time they left a country, they left behind them a civil war or a lot of unrest.
And I don't think every time, but it's always very difficult for the power, for the hegemon to leave, because you leave a vacuum.
Yeah.
So we have two segments left, and so we're going to continue with Bantry House and Edgerton, Shelswell, White. So I visited the house sometime in the beginning of 2006, 2007. And I spoke to Edgerton about the house and how, first of all, was there ever a threat in burning it down? And secondly, how did the family feel? Did they feel secure living in the town in the 60s and 70s?
Edgerton, Shelswell, White, here in Bantry House. It's lovely to be here and talking to you in such a historic and wonderful house. How far? It's not early Georgian. It goes back even.
It goes back before that. It was, I think, built in about 1690, where you come in the front door. It was just a small Queen Anne house, a small square house. It had 3 floors. And we actually have one of the foundation stones on the right of the front door as you come in, which is actually dated 1690. And that was belonged to a family by the name of Hutchinson. My family, who were living on Willie Island, just out in the bay, actually bought it from them in about 1730. So it was already a 40-year-old house when they bought it. And
was this house ever under threat? I mean, was there any threats made?
Well, I remember one that my father had, but it was much later. It was he came back from England in about 48 or 49, I think.
And I remember him getting a letter saying that the house was going to be blown up or something, and he got us all out of bed and took us down to the end of the garden in case it happened. But that was the only one I remember.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you never know. I mean, you think now that time has passed and that that there is no threat now. Now, you may be blinding yourself, but we feel now that we've lived with Bantry so long, and we've built up tourism together. I mean, us as well as the town and everything. You don't feel threatened now, but I think in those days one did a bit.
So we've come to the last segment of this presentation, and we're going to move down finally back to County Waterford. We started with Waterford, we're finishing, to Cappoquin and the Keens. So this is Cappoquin House, and again in 1922 was burnt down, or burnt by the IRA, was gutted, and had been restored and rebuilt afterwards. I spoke to Charles Keane, and I first asked him about the background. And interestingly, Mount Mellery, which was on the Keane land, his ancestor had given the land to the Cistercian monks to build their monastery there.
Charles Keane here in Cappoquin. Just take me back to the early days growing up here in this wonderful house. How many generations of the Keanes now?
We began in 1717.
After the Battle of the Boyne.
After the Battle of the Boyne. But we weren't at the Battle of the Boyne at all. That's nonsense. Yeah. I didn't think.
Yeah.
Why they came here? They came here with a 999-year lease, which they must have bought. So they bought the village of Cappoquin. Although they took the lease, which is 999 days, the same as buying. The village of Cappoquin, the house here, and 10,000 acres. So they must have substantial capital to do that. Where they got that money from, I have no idea.
Mm.
And nor does anyone, as far as I know.
What about the Mount Mellery up the road, the Cistercians? Were the Keanes responsible for?
Well, they came, when was it? You know the date. When was it? 1840?
Around that time, yeah.
Well, they had problems in France, with the anti-religious feelings in France. And the abbot came over to Ireland, and I think it was at Jimana, actually, which where you're going. They had dinner, and at dinner, then Keane said, well, I got some land in the mountain no one wants, and I've not used it, or you better have that. And so they moved in. And obviously they had to add some form of lease at the time on peppercorn rent.
Mm-hmm. And
they've been there ever since.
Mm-hmm. And just bringing you forward a little bit to the 1916, 1923, the troubles and the burning down of this house.
Yeah, well, my understanding is that they were living in London and they knew it was going to be burnt, and that I remember her telling me that she managed to get 2 Nat Ross band-aids of furniture over to England on the basis they could no longer afford to live here, and that what was then in the house was taken out and put into the cellar, and the cellars were then bricked up so it wouldn't be found. And there was the mantelpieces and chandeliers and that sort of thing. So they were not burnt.
And who was it? Your mother or your grandmother?
Was it my grandmother?
Your grandmother would have been responsible.
Your grandmother for that, yes.
Yes. So she must have been a very able.
Oh, yeah, she was a terrifying late lady. I mean, you saw a picture of her, totally terrifying. A huge nose. And her father had been Lord Lieutenant here in Dublin.
Well, just remind me again. Her maiden name was
Make Speech.
And
her father was Chancellor of the Exchequer under Salisbury, and then was Lord Lieutenant here in Dublin. And that's presumably when she met my grandfather.
Right, yes. How did they meet? Any idea?
I had no idea.
Never asked her.
No idea. No idea at all. No idea at all.
Did she ever talk about those times?
Not really. Not really. We were too young to ask. That's the trouble.
Yeah.
Always.
Or do you remember anything that she might have said that had to do with the estate here?
Oh yes, I remember. I mean, this was turned in by the workers into a communist commune here. Presumably in 1918, or no, when the Civil War started, I suppose. I know that when the house was burnt, they raided the cellar and they pinched the champagne. They drank the champagne, and the communist commune fell apart. But this is all hearsay.
Yeah. So, but was there a kind of a tendency to
No.
want to do that type of?
I know there was no tendency to want to tell, actually, which is strange.
Yeah.
No tendency to want to put it on. Although she left quite careful notes.
Yeah.
She bundled up the letters and things like that.
Oh, right. And you have those, do you?
We have letters, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they would tell a lot about what was happening at that time.
Probably. And they were supposed to try to kidnap my grandfather on the way back from a meeting in Dungarvan. And they didn't get him because he decided to walk down the railway line.
He knew this was going to happen.
I don't know, but all I know is they tried to kidnap him, and they didn't get him because he walked. He was always walking everywhere. He was very popular in the town.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And was there much animosity towards him?
No, I wouldn't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I would think so. I think, well, you know the story from Mitchell's time, and it was orders, wasn't it? They were told to burn this in that place.
Mm-hmm.
That it wasn't animosity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now there's a lot to take in all of that, and so yes, we've come to the end, and I hope you enjoyed listening to the voices of the great houses, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice, for joining us this evening.
Yeah,
we really enjoyed that. And can I just ask you a couple of questions? And we're looking in the background there. We have a fantastic archive. How many interviews did you conduct in total?
Yeah, well, we set up our organisation, Irish Life and Lore, in 1997, 1998. So we're recording that length of time. And so we have something over 4,000 individual interviews sitting on the shelves. So it's a wonderful library of sound, of audio. And there's nothing more authentic than the voice. You know, it speaks volumes.
Fantastic, Maurice. And a lot of these audio clips are available on your website.
Yes, yes, indeed. Irish Life and Lore offers a wonderful collection of downloads. And it's very easy to navigate as well, because we have we've all the collections in county by county, or you can Google the person's name, or you can go into a particular theme, like the Irish Country House or 1916 Rising, and so on. And of course, can I tell you, Liam, it's not all me. I mean, this organization wouldn't run without my wife, Jane. And of course, Jane has written a number of books, and we were just talking about the voices of the great houses. So Jane wrote this in 2006, and it was launched in Muckross House at the time. And so it's called Voices of the Great Houses, Cork and Kerry. And again, some of the extracts you heard there, Edgerton Shelswell White has been, there's a whole chapter in this book about him. Yeah, and we have a daughter, Elaine O'Keeffe, Dr. Elaine O'Keeffe, and of course, without her, our she looks after her website, and she looks after an awful lot of what we do.
Well, thank you, Maurice, and thanks for taking the time and joining us this evening. I think it's a fascinating aspect of our Irish history, an aspect probably often overlooked. I'm from a town called Milltown myself in County Kerry, and my friend John Knightley has done a lot of work on the local aristocracy there, the Godfrey family, and it's that story is included in your wife's book, and it's a fascinating read. So I thoroughly recommend it. So thank you very much for joining us, Maurice. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.